A Kingdom Reborn. London, 1918. Victoria Morgan unearthed a tarnished locket in a derelict manor, inside of which was a miniature portrait bearing the inscription "Forever in my heart, Captain Edward Riley," stirring buried emotions. Chapter 1. The Whispers of Ashworth Manor. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying roses as Victoria Morgan stepped through the shattered remnants of what had once been a grand doorway. Ashworth Manor, or what remained of it, stood silhouetted against the bruised, gray London sky of late October 1918. The war, that relentless beast, had spared little, not even the grand old estates on the outskirts of the city. A stray bomb, they said, had found its mark 2 years prior, leaving the West Wing a gaping maw of broken brick and twisted metal. Victoria adjusted the worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder, its weight a familiar comfort. Inside were the tools of her trade, a small trowel, brushes of varying sizes, and carefully folded linen cloths for wrapping any discoveries. She was not an archaeologist, not in the formal sense. Officially, she was a volunteer with the Historical Preservation Society, tasked with salvaging whatever artifacts might be found amidst the ruins of war-damaged buildings. Unofficially, she was a hunter of stories, a seeker of the whispers left behind by lives lived and lost. The manor had been in the Ashworth family for generations, its history woven into the very fabric of England. Now it was a ghost, its rooms filled with the dust of forgotten memories and the unsettling quiet that follows devastation. Victoria had been drawn to it, not by any specific assignment, but by a persistent, almost melancholic pull. She felt it in the rustling of the overgrown ivy that clawed at the remaining walls, in the mournful creak of a loose shutter banging against a window frame. She moved cautiously through the debris-strewn entrance hall, her boots crunching on shattered glass and plaster. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else of faint, almost floral fragrance that seemed out of place amidst the destruction. It reminded her of her grandmother's garden, a place of vibrant colors and heady scents that had long since faded into the monochrome of wartime London. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through a hole in the roof, illuminating a section of the once opulent staircase. The mahogany banister, miraculously intact, gleamed dully, a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era. Victoria ran a gloved hand along its smooth surface, imagining the elegant ladies and distinguished gentlemen who had once ascended those stairs, their lives filled with a certainty that had been shattered by the war. She continued her exploration, moving through the skeletal remains of the drawing room, where fragments of a once magnificent chandelier lay scattered like fallen stars. A fireplace, its marble surround cracked and blackened, still held the faint scent of wood smoke, a ghostly reminder of warmer, more peaceful times. It was in a small alcove, hidden behind a partially collapsed wall, that she found it. A small, wooden box, half buried beneath a pile of rubble. It was unremarkable, its surface covered in a layer of grime and dust. But as Victoria carefully brushed away the debris, she noticed an intricate carving on the lid, a single, perfectly formed rose. Intrigued, she lifted the box, its weight surprising her. It felt substantial, as if holding something precious. Her heart beat a little faster as she opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a locket. It was tarnished, its silver surface dulled with age and neglect. But even in its diminished state, it possessed a certain elegance, a quiet beauty that spoke of a time when such trinkets were treasured possessions. Victoria carefully lifted the locket, her fingers tracing the delicate chain. It felt cold against her skin, yet somehow alive. As she held it, she felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her fingertips that spread up her arm. It was almost as if the locket were vibrating, humming with a silent energy. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, 2 miniature portraits faced each other. On one side, a young woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of auburn curls. On the other, a man in uniform, a captain, judging by the insignia on his collar. He was strikingly handsome, with a strong jawline and a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very depths of her soul. His eyes, even in the faded miniature, held a hint of sadness, a shadow of something unspoken. Beneath his portrait, an inscription, barely legible in the fading light, "Forever in my heart, Captain Edward Riley." The name meant nothing to her. Yet, as she stared at the portrait, she felt a pang of something. Recognition? Sorrow? It was as if she had seen him before, in a dream, perhaps, or in a life she couldn't quite remember. The woman in the other portrait, she assumed, was his wife, or perhaps his sweetheart. The inscription certainly suggested a deep and enduring love. A sudden gust of wind rattled the loose window panes, sending a shiver down Victoria's spine. The floral scent she had noticed earlier intensified, filling the alcove with its sweet, melancholic fragrance. She looked around, suddenly feeling uneasy, as if she were not alone. The whispers of Ashworth Manor seemed to be growing louder, swirling around her like unseen spirits. She closed the locket, the click echoing in the silence. The tingling sensation in her fingertips remained, a persistent reminder of the connection she felt to this unknown captain and the woman who had held him in her heart. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this locket was more than just a trinket. It was a key, a doorway to a story that was waiting to be told. A story that, somehow, she was meant to uncover. She carefully placed the locket in her satchel, next to the wooden box. The weight of it felt significant, not just in terms of its physical presence, but in the emotional burden it seemed to carry. She had a feeling that this discovery would change her life, that it would lead her down a path she had never anticipated. A path that would intertwine her own destiny with that of Captain Edward Riley and the secrets hidden within the walls of Ashworth Manor. She must know who will accompany and guide her. Chapter 2. A Portrait Frozen in Time. Back in her small, sparsely furnished flat in Bloomsbury, Victoria laid the locket and the wooden box on her worn kitchen table. The single gas lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the chipped paint on the walls and the threadbare rug on the floor. Outside, the London night was settling in, a thick fog creeping through the streets, muffling the sounds of the city. Even the distant rumble of trams and the occasional honking of a motor car seemed muted, as if the fog itself were a shroud, concealing secrets and sorrows. Victoria poured herself a cup of weak tea, the lukewarm liquid doing little to dispel the chill that had settled in her bones. It wasn't just the physical cold of the October evening, it was a deeper chill, a sense of unease that had lingered since her visit to Ashworth Manor. The locket, with its haunting portraits, seemed to exude a palpable sadness, a weight of unspoken grief that resonated with her own quiet melancholy. She had lost her brother, Thomas, at the Somme 2 years earlier. The telegram, delivered by a grim-faced messenger, had been brief and brutal. "Regret to inform you killed in action." The words had been like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving a gaping hole in her heart. She had barely begun to process the loss when her fiancé, a young lieutenant named Arthur, had been shipped off to France. His letters, at first filled with youthful optimism and declarations of love, had gradually become shorter, more infrequent, and tinged with a weariness that mirrored the growing despair of the war. The last letter, received 6 months ago, had been particularly unsettling, filled with cryptic references to the horrors he had witnessed and a sense of foreboding that had left Victoria with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had received no further word since. She picked up the locket again, her fingers tracing the outline of Captain Riley's face. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s. His eyes, even in the miniature, held a depth of character, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that drew her in. She wondered what his story was. What battles had he fought? What losses had he endured? And who was the woman with the auburn curls, the woman who had held him forever in her heart? She opened the locket again, studying the woman's portrait more closely. She was undeniably beautiful, with a delicate, almost ethereal quality. Her smile was radiant, her eyes sparkling with a joy that seemed untainted by the shadows of war. Victoria felt a pang of envy, a longing for a time when such carefree happiness had seemed possible. She examined the inscription again, running her finger over the engraved words. Forever in my heart, it was a common enough sentiment, often found on love tokens and keepsakes. But there was something about the way it was written, a slight irregularity in the lettering, that suggested a sense of urgency, of desperation. As if the words had been etched in haste, perhaps under duress. Victoria closed the locket and turned it over, examining the back. There were no other markings, no initials or dates. Just the smooth, tarnished silver. She sighed, feeling a familiar wave of frustration. The locket was a puzzle, a silent witness to a love story that was shrouded in mystery. She decided to examine the wooden box more closely. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, possibly mahogany. The carving of the rose on the lid was intricate and detailed, the petals almost lifelike. She ran her finger over the smooth, cool surface, feeling a faint vibration, similar to the one she had experienced when holding the locket. Inside the box, beneath the layer of faded velvet, she found a small, folded piece of paper. It was brittle and yellowed with age, the ink faded almost to the point of illegibility. With trembling hands, she carefully unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note. It was a fragment of a letter, the beginning and end missing. The handwriting was hurried and uneven, as if the writer had been in a state of distress. Cannot bear the thought of without you the danger is every day must find a way meet me the rose garden midnight, if I don't know that the rest of the letter was torn away, leaving the message incomplete. Victoria read the fragment again and again, her mind racing. The words were filled with a sense of urgency and fear. The reference to the rose garden seemed significant, perhaps a clue to the identity of the writer and the recipient. Ashworth Manor, she recalled, had once been famous for its extensive rose gardens. She felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a lost love token. This was a cry for help, a message from the past that was begging to be deciphered. She had to find out more. She had to uncover the truth behind the locket and the fragmented letter. She looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was almost 10 o'clock. Too late to do anything tonight. But tomorrow, she would start her investigation. She would begin by researching the Ashworth family and Captain Edward Riley. She would visit the local library, the War Office records, anything that might shed light on this mystery. As she prepared for bed, the locket lay on her bedside table, its silver surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. She felt a strange connection to it, a sense of responsibility to the unknown captain and the woman who had loved him. She knew that this journey would not be easy, that it might lead her down a dangerous path. But she was determined to see it through, to unravel the secrets of Ashworth Manor and bring peace to the restless spirits that seemed to linger within its walls. And a crucial piece of evidence must be in that rose garden, wherever it may be. Chapter 3. The Captain's Shadow. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, mirroring Victoria's mood. The excitement she had felt the previous night had been replaced by a sense of apprehension, a realization of the daunting task she had set for herself. Unraveling the mystery of the locket and Captain Edward Riley would be like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. She started her day at the British Library, its imposing architecture and hushed atmosphere a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. The reading room was filled with scholars and researchers, their heads bent over books and manuscripts, lost in their own worlds of knowledge. Victoria felt a familiar sense of comfort in this place, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations. She spent hours poring over old records, searching for any mention of the Ashworth family and Captain Edward Riley. She found references to the Ashworths in various historical documents, tracing their lineage back to the 17th century. They had been a prominent family, involved in politics, business, and the military. But there was no mention of a Captain Edward Riley in any of the family records. Frustrated, she decided to shift her focus to the War Office archives. This was a more challenging undertaking, requiring special permission and navigating a labyrinthine bureaucracy. She spent hours filling out forms and waiting in long queues, her patience wearing thin. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she was granted access to the records of officers who had served in the Great War. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Thousands of names, each representing a life touched by the war. A story of courage, sacrifice, and loss. Victoria meticulously scanned the lists, her eyes growing tired, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. Just as she was about to give up, she found it. A record for a Captain Edward Riley, listed as serving with the Royal Fusiliers. His date of birth matched the approximate age she had estimated from the portrait. He had been awarded the Military Cross for bravery, and her breath caught in her throat. He was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, near Ypres, in 1916. The same year the bomb hit Ashworth Manor. A wave of sadness washed over Victoria. So, the captain had not survived the war. The locket, then, was a memento of a love tragically cut short. But the fragmented letter, with its desperate plea for a meeting in the Rose Garden, suggested that there was more to the story. Had he returned, perhaps briefly, before his death? Or had the letter been written before his final deployment? She copied down the details of Captain Riley's service record, including his regiment number and the date of his disappearance. She also noted the name of his next of kin, a Mrs. Eleanor Riley, residing at an address in Ashworth Village, near the manor. Eleanor, the woman in the locket. Victoria felt a surge of excitement, mixed with a growing sense of dread. She had found the captain's wife, or at least, she believed she had. But what would she say to her? How would she explain her possession of the locket? And what secrets would this encounter reveal? She left the War Office archives with a heavy heart and a mind buzzing with questions. The London fog had thickened, swirling around her like a living entity, obscuring the familiar landmarks and creating an atmosphere of mystery and uncertainty. She decided to take a tram to Ashworth Village. It was a long journey, taking her through the heart of the city and out into the surrounding countryside. As the tram rattled along, she clutched the locket in her pocket, its smooth surface a tangible link to the past. She imagined Eleanor Riley, waiting for her husband to return, her heart filled with hope and fear. She wondered if Eleanor ever knew what really happened, what that last letter contained. Did she keep searching, as Victoria had done? The weight of unanswered questions pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for Eleanor and for the memory of the captain who had perished in the mud and blood of the Western Front. She felt that she was to carry a torch for those who could no longer hold one, an insight that only fueled her determination. She would locate that village and find Mrs. Riley. Chapter 4. Letters from the Front. The journey to Ashworth Village was long and arduous. The tram eventually gave way to a local bus, a rickety, smoke-belching vehicle that seemed to struggle with every hill. The landscape gradually changed from the urban sprawl of London to the rolling green fields of the countryside. But even here, the war had left its mark. Fields lay fallow, their fences broken, and many of the houses she passed bore the scars of bomb damage. As the bus neared Ashworth, Victoria felt a growing sense of anticipation, mixed with a knot of anxiety. She was about to enter a world that was both familiar and foreign, a world where the past clung to the present like the ivy that draped the ancient stone walls. The village itself was small and picturesque, a cluster of cottages and shops gathered around a village green. A Norman church, its spire reaching towards the gray sky, dominated the scene. The air was clean and crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It was a world away from the noise and grime of London, yet the war seemed to hover over it like a dark cloud. Victoria asked the bus driver for directions to the address she had copied from the War Office records. He pointed her towards a narrow lane that wound its way out of the village, past a row of thatched cottages. Mrs. Riley? Lives at the end of the lane, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. Haven't seen much of her lately. Keeps to herself, mostly. Victoria thanked him and set off down the lane, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The cottages were charming, with small gardens filled with late-blooming roses and chrysanthemums. But there was an air of quiet desolation about them, a sense of lives lived in the shadow of loss. The last cottage on the lane was set back from the road, surrounded by a high stone wall. A wrought iron gate, its hinges rusted and creaking, stood slightly ajar. Victoria hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The home of Eleanor Riley, the woman in the locket. She took a deep breath and pushed the gate open, stepping into a small, overgrown garden. The cottage itself was modest, with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof. The windows were dark and curtained, giving the impression of a house that had been closed off from the world. Victoria approached the front door, a heavy oak affair with a tarnished brass knocker. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, her courage faltering. What would she say? How would she explain her presence? Before she could decide, the door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the interior. She was older than Victoria had expected, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with sorrow. But her eyes, though filled with a deep sadness, still held a spark of the radiant beauty that Victoria had seen in the locket. "Mrs. Riley?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, her gaze fixed on Victoria with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. "Yes." "And you are?" Victoria hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My name is Victoria Morgan. I found something that I believe belongs to you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it out to Eleanor. The older woman's eyes widened as she recognized the familiar trinket. She reached out a trembling hand and took the locket, her fingers closing around it as if it were a precious relic. Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "At Ashworth Manor," Victoria replied. "In a small box hidden in the ruins." Eleanor's face paled. She stepped back, as if struck by a blow. "The manor, but how?" Victoria explained her work with the Historical Preservation Society, her discovery of the box and the locket, and her subsequent research into Captain Riley's military record. She spoke slowly and carefully, trying to convey her sympathy and her genuine desire to help. Eleanor listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the locket. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks, tracing paths through the lines of grief etched on her face. He was missing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told me he was dead. But I never believed it. I always hoped." She broke off, unable to continue. Victoria reached out and gently touched her arm. "I understand," she said softly. "My brother, he was killed at the Somme." Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a shared understanding of loss. "It never goes away, does it?" she said quietly. "The pain, the emptiness." Victoria shook her head. "No," she said. "But sometimes there are things that can help. Stories, memories, connections." Eleanor opened the locket, her fingers tracing the miniature portraits of herself and Edward. "He gave me this before he left," she said. "He said it would keep us connected, no matter what happened." She closed the locket and looked at Victoria. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing this back to me. It means more than you know." She invited Victoria inside the cottage. The interior was small and sparsely furnished, but it had a cozy, lived-in feel. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Photographs of Edward, in uniform and in civilian clothes, adorned the mantelpiece and the walls. Eleanor offered Victoria a cup of tea, and they sat by the fire, talking for hours. Eleanor shared stories of her life with Edward, their courtship, their marriage, and their brief, happy years together before the war intervened. She spoke of his courage, his kindness, and his unwavering love for her. She also showed Victoria a collection of letters that Edward had written to her from the front. They were filled with his love, his longing, and his descriptions of the horrors of trench warfare. Victoria read them with a growing sense of awe and sadness, realizing the depth of the bond that had existed between Edward and Eleanor. The last few letters speak about a growing threat, a man who seems to suspect Edward of something. Chapter 5. Beneath the London Fog. Eleanor carefully folded the last of Edward's letters, her hands trembling slightly. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink faded with time, but the words still held the power to transport her back to those agonizing days of waiting and hoping. She looked at Victoria, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "These letters, they are all I have left of him," she said softly. "Except for the locket, of course. And now this." She gestured towards a small, leather-bound journal that lay on the table between them. Victoria had noticed it earlier, but had been hesitant to ask about it. It looked old and well-worn, its pages filled with Edward's distinctive handwriting. "What is it?" Victoria asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "It's Edward's journal," Eleanor replied. "He kept it throughout the war, whenever he had a spare moment. He wrote about his experiences, his thoughts, his fears, and his suspicions." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. "Suspicions?" she repeated. "About what?" Eleanor hesitated, then took a deep breath. "He believed there was a spy in his regiment," she said. "Someone who was passing information to the enemy. He didn't know who it was, but he was convinced of it. He wrote about it in his journal, in coded language, of course. He was afraid of it falling into the wrong hands." The final letters had hinted at this, but the journal seemed to confirm it. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. This added a whole new layer of complexity to the mystery. It wasn't just a story of lost love, it was a story of espionage, betrayal, and danger. "Did he ever identify the spy?" Victoria asked. Eleanor shook her head.
"No," she said.
"The last entry in the journal is dated just a few days before he went missing. He wrote that he was close to uncovering the truth, but that he needed to be careful. He said he had a plan, a way to expose the spy. But he never got the chance." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the journal. May I read it?"
she asked.
Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," she said. I think Edward would have wanted you to. He would have wanted the truth to come out, no matter what." Victoria carefully picked up the journal, her hands trembling with anticipation. She opened it to the first page and began to read. The early entries were mostly about Edward's training and his initial experiences in France. He wrote about the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, the boredom of life in the trenches, and the constant fear of death. But as the journal progressed, the tone changed. Edward's entries became shorter, more cryptic, and filled with a growing sense of unease. He began to mention his suspicions about a spy, referring to him only as the Raven. He described subtle clues, overheard conversations, and suspicious incidents that had led him to believe that someone in his regiment was working for the enemy. Victoria read with growing fascination, her mind racing to decipher the coded language and piece together the puzzle. She realized that Edward had been a keen observer, a meticulous recorder of details. He had noticed things that others had missed, and he had been brave enough to question the official narrative. The final entry, dated a week before his disappearance, was particularly chilling. "The Raven grows bolder," Edward had written. "He suspects that I am on to him. I must act quickly. I have a plan. I will meet him at the designated place, under the guise of I cannot write more. If this journal falls into the wrong hands, God help us all." The entry ended abruptly, leaving Victoria with a sense of frustration and foreboding. What was the designated place? What was Edward's plan? And who was the Raven? She closed the journal, her mind buzzing with questions. She looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "This changes everything," Victoria said. "This isn't just about finding out what happened to Edward. It's about uncovering a conspiracy, a betrayal that may have cost many lives." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said. "I've always known, deep down, that there was more to Edward's disappearance than just the war. He was too careful, too dedicated, to simply vanish without a trace." Victoria felt a surge of determination. She had to find out the truth, not just for Edward and Eleanor, but for all the soldiers who had been betrayed by the Raven. She had to expose the spy and bring him to justice. "We need to go back to Ashworth Manor," she said. "To the Rose Garden. That's where Edward intended to meet someone. It might hold a clue. It's also where the partial letter instructed the recipient to meet." Eleanor agreed. They decided to return to London together, and then travel to the manor the following day. As they journeyed back to the city, the fog seemed to lift, replaced by a clear, starry sky. But Victoria knew that the darkness was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The secrets of Ashworth Manor and the identity of the Raven were about to be exposed. She had to figure out a way to bring light to the shadowy corners of this mystery. Chapter 6. The Nightingale's Song of Sorrow. The return to Ashworth Manor was shrouded in a palpable tension. The gray, overcast sky pressed down on the ruins, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the swaying branches of the overgrown trees. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying roses, seemed to hum with a silent energy, a symphony of whispers from the past. Victoria and Eleanor stood before the remnants of the once magnificent rose garden. It was a scene of utter desolation. The carefully manicured beds, once bursting with vibrant colors and intoxicating fragrances, were now choked with weeds and brambles. The stone pathways, once trodden by elegant ladies and gentlemen, were cracked and overgrown, disappearing beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. But amidst the decay, a few hardy rose bushes still clung to life, their blooms a poignant reminder of the beauty that had once been. Victoria noticed a particular bush, its branches laden with deep red roses, their velvety petals unfurling in the weak sunlight. It stood near a crumbling stone fountain, its basin filled with stagnant water and fallen leaves. This feels like the place," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. Edward described the fountain in one of his letters. He said it was a meeting place, a place where he and others would exchange information. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. The fountain, the rose bush, the designated place mentioned in Edward's journal. It all seemed to fit. But what were they looking for? A hidden message? A secret compartment? They began to search, carefully examining the rose bushes, the fountain, and the surrounding area. They worked in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, their senses heightened by the weight of the past. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the distant rumble of thunder, promising a storm. As they searched, Victoria noticed something peculiar about the fountain. One of the stone cherubs that adorned its rim was slightly out of alignment. She ran her fingers over its smooth, cold surface, feeling a subtle difference in texture. It was looser than the others. "Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with excitement. I think I've found something." Eleanor hurried to her side, her eyes wide with anticipation. Victoria carefully manipulated the cherub, twisting it gently. With a click, a small section of the fountain's rim slid open, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, lay a small, metal box. It was rusted and corroded, but otherwise intact. Victoria reached in and carefully lifted it out, her heart pounding in her chest. They opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, they found a collection of documents, letters, maps, and coded messages. Victoria recognized Edward's handwriting on some of the documents. Others were written in a different hand, a spidery, almost illegible script. These are the Raven's messages," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with horror. "This is the evidence Edward was looking for." Victoria began to examine the documents, her mind racing to decipher the coded messages. She realized that the Raven had been passing information about troop movements, supply lines, and military strategies to the enemy. The information was detailed and accurate, suggesting that the Raven had access to high-level intelligence. As she read, she came across a letter that made her blood run cold. It was addressed to a German officer, and it contained a detailed description of a planned Allied offensive. The offensive was scheduled to take place on the very day that Edward had gone missing. "This is it," Victoria said, her voice shaking. "This is why Edward was killed. He was about to expose the Raven, and the Raven silenced him." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But who is it?" she whispered. "Who is the Raven?" Victoria continued to examine the documents, searching for any clue, any hint of the Raven's identity. She found a recurring symbol, a small, stylized raven, drawn in the corner of several of the messages. It was a signature, a mark of the raven's treachery. Suddenly, she noticed something else. A small, almost imperceptible detail on one of the letters. A watermark, embedded in the paper. It was the crest of a prominent British family, the Ashworths. Victoria's heart sank. The Ashworths. The family who owned the manor. The family who had been so deeply affected by the war. Could it be possible? Could one of them be the Raven? A flash of lightning illuminated the ruins, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The storm had arrived. As the rain began to fall, washing away the dust and grime of the past, Victoria felt a profound sense of sadness, mixed with a burning determination. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and resolve. I think I know who the Raven is, she said. And it's someone closer than we ever imagined. She must inform Eleanor of her discovery. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Forgotten Promise. The rain lashed against the windows of Eleanor's London flat, mirroring the turmoil in Victoria's heart. The revelation at Ashworth Manor, the Ashworth crest as a watermark on the Raven's letter, had cast a long, dark shadow over everything. It was a betrayal that cut deep, twisting the knife of grief and loss with the poison of suspicion. The Ashworths, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside. But which one? There were so many of them. Victoria spread the documents they had retrieved from the hidden compartment on the kitchen table. The gaslight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the faded ink and cryptic symbols. She pointed to the recurring raven symbol, drawn with a distinctive flourish. This symbol, it's on several of the documents, she said. And the watermark, it's definitely the Ashworth crest. But there's something else, something I noticed when I was researching the family at the library. She pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with her meticulous notes and sketches. She flipped through it, stopping at a page where she had copied a family tree of the Ashworths. The Ashworth family had several branches, she explained. Most of them were involved in the military or government. But there was one branch, a younger son, who was disinherited by his father for various reasons. He was known for his rebellious nature, his gambling debts, and his pro-German sympathies. She pointed to a name on the family tree, Alistair Ashworth. Eleanor leaned closer, her eyes widening as she recognized the name. Alistair, she whispered. I remember Edward mentioning him. He said Alistair was a distant cousin. He used to visit the manor sometimes, before the war. Edward didn't trust him. He said Alistair was always asking questions, prying into things that didn't concern him.
Victoria nodded.
Alistair Ashworth fits the profile of the Raven, she said. He had the motive resentment towards his family, financial difficulties. He had the opportunity access to the manor, connections to the military through his relatives. And he had the means, the knowledge of codes and ciphers, perhaps learned during his brief stint in military intelligence before he was dismissed for insubordination. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a chilling picture of betrayal and deceit. Alistair Ashworth, driven by bitterness and greed, had sold his country's secrets to the enemy, causing the deaths of countless soldiers, including his own cousin, Edward. But why would he do it? Eleanor asked, her voice filled with anguish. Why would he betray his own family, his own country?
Victoria sighed.
I don't know, she said. Perhaps he was motivated by money. Perhaps he believed in the German cause. Or perhaps he was simply a twisted, bitter man who enjoyed causing pain and destruction. She looked at Eleanor, her heart aching for the woman who had suffered so much. I'm so sorry, Eleanor, she said. I know this is devastating. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. It's like losing Edward all over again, she whispered. Knowing that someone he knew, someone he might have even considered a friend, was responsible for his death. Victoria reached out and took Eleanor's hand, offering a silent gesture of comfort and support. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the occasional crackle of the fire. We have to do something, Victoria said finally, her voice filled with determination. We have to expose Alistair. We have to bring him to justice. Eleanor nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. Yes, she said. We owe it to Edward. We owe it to all the others who died because of him. But how could they expose Alistair? He was a powerful man, with connections in high places. And the war was almost over. Would anyone even care about a spy who had operated years ago? Victoria knew that it wouldn't be easy.
But she was determined to try.
She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. She owed it to Edward, to Eleanor, and to herself. She had to unravel the final threads of this tangled web of deceit and bring the Raven to justice. The forgotten promise made in the locket, the love that transcended the war, needed vindication. She must find a way to confront Alistair. Chapter 8. The Secret of the Rose Garden. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world and a sky tinged with the promise of a new dawn. But the darkness in Victoria's heart remained, a heavy weight that no amount of sunshine could dispel. The knowledge that Alistair Ashworth, a man connected to Edward by blood and betrayal, was the Raven, had cast a long shadow over everything. She and Eleanor had spent the night poring over the documents they had found in the hidden compartment, searching for any further clues, any evidence that could definitively link Alistair to the espionage. They found several letters signed with the Raven symbol, addressed to a German contact in London. The letters contained detailed information about troop movements, supply lines, and military strategies, confirming Alistair's treachery beyond any doubt. But they also found something else, something unexpected. A small, folded piece of paper, tucked inside one of the letters. It was a map, a hand-drawn sketch of Ashworth Manor and the surrounding grounds. There was a specific location marked on the map, a small, secluded area within the rose garden near the old greenhouse. An X marked the spot with a single word written beneath it: sunrise. Victoria and Eleanor exchanged a look of puzzlement. What did it mean? What was hidden in the rose garden, near the greenhouse? And why sunrise? They decided to return to Ashworth Manor one last time. They needed to see for themselves what was hidden at the designated spot. They needed to find the final piece of the puzzle. The journey to Ashworth was filled with a sense of foreboding. The closer they got to the manor, the heavier the atmosphere became. The whispers of the past seemed to be growing louder, swirling around them like unseen spirits. They arrived at the manor just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the ruins. The rose garden, still damp from the previous night's rain, looked even more desolate than before. But the few remaining rose bushes, their blooms heavy with dew, seemed to glow with an ethereal beauty. They made their way to the greenhouse, a crumbling structure of glass and metal, its panes shattered and overgrown with ivy. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world, a place where time had stood still. Following the map, they located the designated spot, a small, overgrown patch of ground near the back wall of the greenhouse. An X had been scratched into the soil, barely visible beneath a layer of leaves and debris. Victoria knelt down and began to dig, using her small trowel. The soil was hard and compacted, but she persevered, driven by a sense of urgency. Eleanor stood beside her, watching with bated breath, her hands clasped tightly together. After what seemed like an eternity, Victoria's trowel struck something hard. She carefully cleared away the soil, revealing a small, wooden box. It was similar to the one she had found in the alcove, but this one was smaller and more intricately carved. They lifted the box out of the ground, their hands trembling with anticipation. They opened it with bated breath. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object, a small, silver key. Victoria and Eleanor exchanged a look of confusion. A key? What did it unlock? What secret was it meant to reveal? As they examined the key, Victoria noticed something engraved on its handle, a tiny, almost imperceptible symbol, a nightingale. The nightingale. Another code name? Another player in this intricate game of espionage? Suddenly, Victoria remembered something. A passage in Edward's journal, a cryptic reference to a nightingale's song. He had written about overhearing a conversation, a secret meeting between two people, one of whom was referred to as the Nightingale. He had suspected that the Nightingale was a high-ranking official, someone with access to sensitive information. Could the Nightingale be connected to Alistair? Could this key be the link between them? She realized she must find what the key opens. Chapter 9. Between Duty and Desire. The discovery of the silver key, engraved with a nightingale symbol, had thrown another twist into the already complex web of secrets surrounding Ashworth Manor. Victoria and Eleanor returned to London, their minds buzzing with questions. Who was the Nightingale? And what did the key unlock? They spent hours poring over Edward's journal and the documents they had found, searching for any further mention of the Nightingale. They found several references scattered throughout the journal, but they were all cryptic and ambiguous. Edward had clearly been trying to protect the Nightingale's identity, even in his private writings. He was afraid, Eleanor said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He knew that the Nightingale was someone powerful, someone who could silence him if he got too close. Victoria nodded, her own fears growing with each passing hour. They were dealing with dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They decided to focus their attention on the key itself. It was small and delicate, made of silver, with intricate carvings on its handle. It looked old, possibly dating back to the 18th century. It certainly didn't look like a key that would unlock anything in Ashworth Manor, which had been mostly rebuilt in the Victorian era. Perhaps it's not a door key, Victoria suggested. Perhaps it unlocks a box, a safe, or something else entirely. They spent the next few days visiting antique shops, locksmiths, and historical societies, trying to find someone who could identify the key and its purpose. But they had no luck. No one had ever seen a key quite like it. Just as they were about to give up, Victoria had an idea. She remembered a passage in one of Edward's letters where he described a visit to a friend's estate in the Cotswolds. The friend, a retired diplomat named Sir Charles Barrington, was a collector of antique keys and locks. He had shown Edward his collection, and Edward had been fascinated by it. Perhaps Sir Charles might know something about this key, Victoria said. It's a long shot, but it's worth a try. Eleanor agreed. They decided to travel to the Cotswolds to visit Sir Charles and seek his expert opinion. The journey to the Cotswolds was long and tiring, but the scenery was breathtaking. The rolling hills, the picturesque villages, and the ancient stone houses seemed to transport them to a different world, a world far removed from the horrors of war and the dark secrets of Ashworth Manor. They arrived at Sir Charles's estate in the late afternoon. It was a grand old house, surrounded by acres of manicured gardens and parkland. A butler greeted them at the door and ushered them into a spacious drawing room where Sir Charles was waiting for them. He was an elderly gentleman with a distinguished air and a twinkle in his eye. He greeted them warmly and listened with interest as Victoria explained their story and showed him the silver key. Sir Charles examined the key carefully, turning it over in his hands, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. This is a very unusual key, he said. I've never seen anything quite like it. The craftsmanship is exquisite, and the symbol the nightingale, it's very intriguing. He led them to his study, a room filled with antique furniture, books, and glass cases displaying his collection of keys and locks. He spent several minutes comparing the silver key to the others in his collection, muttering to himself in a language that Victoria didn't understand. Finally, he looked up, his face beaming with excitement. I believe I know what this key unlocks, he said. It's a very rare type of lock, known as a nightingale lock. It was invented in the 18th century by a French locksmith, and it was used primarily to secure secret compartments in furniture. Victoria and Eleanor exchanged a look of astonishment. A secret compartment.
But where?
And what did it contain? Sir Charles explained that nightingale locks were incredibly intricate and difficult to open, even with the correct key. They were designed to be virtually impossible to pick, and they often contained hidden mechanisms that would trigger alarms or even traps if tampered with. He believed there might be a document that shows the location. Chapter 10. A Dance with Destiny. Sir Charles's revelation about the Nightingale lock had sent a jolt of excitement through Victoria and Eleanor. A secret compartment, hidden somewhere, held the final key to unlocking the mystery of the Raven and the Nightingale. But where was this compartment? And what did it contain? Sir Charles, caught up in the intrigue, offered his assistance. "I have a few books on 18th century French furniture," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Perhaps they might contain some information about Nightingale locks and their typical placements." He led them to a section of his library dedicated to furniture and design. He pulled out several large, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with intricate drawings and detailed descriptions of antique furniture. They spent hours poring over the books, searching for any mention of Nightingale locks. They found several references, but they were all vague and general, offering no specific clues about their location. Just as they were about to give up, Victoria noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible detail in one of the drawings. A sketch of a writing desk with a tiny symbol of a nightingale engraved on one of its drawers.
"Look,"
she exclaimed, pointing to the drawing. "This desk, it has a nightingale lock." Sir Charles and Eleanor leaned closer, examining the drawing carefully. The desk was a beautiful piece of furniture, made of mahogany, with intricate carvings and inlaid mother of pearl. It was a typical example of 18th century French design. "But where is this desk now?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and frustration. Sir Charles frowned. "That's the problem," he said. "These books are very old, and they don't always provide information about the current whereabouts of the furniture they describe. This desk could be anywhere in a museum, a private collection, or even destroyed." Victoria felt a familiar wave of disappointment. They were so close, yet so far. They had the key, but they didn't know where to find the lock. Suddenly, Eleanor gasped. "Wait a minute," she said, her eyes widening with recognition. I think I've seen this desk before." She rushed out of the study, returning a few minutes later with a photograph album. It was an old album, filled with photographs of Ashworth Manor, taken before the war. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a photograph of the manor's library. And there it was. In the center of the room stood the writing desk from the drawing. The very desk with the nightingale lock. Victoria and Eleanor stared at the photograph, their hearts pounding with excitement. The desk was at Ashworth Manor. All this time, the secret compartment had been right under their noses. But the manor was bombed, Victoria said, her voice filled with uncertainty. The library was destroyed. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said. "But perhaps the desk survived. Perhaps it was salvaged or stored somewhere else." They decided to return to Ashworth Manor one last time. They needed to search the ruins to see if the desk was still there, hidden somewhere amidst the debris. The journey back to Ashworth was filled with a sense of urgency and anticipation. The closer they got to the manor, the stronger their conviction grew. They had to find the desk. They had to unlock the final secret. They arrived at the manor as the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows over the ruins. The rose garden, now completely overgrown, looked even more desolate than before. They made their way to the remnants of the library, a gaping hole in the side of the manor, filled with rubble and twisted metal. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. They began to search, carefully picking their way through the debris, their eyes scanning every inch of the ruined room. They searched for hours, but they found nothing. The desk was gone. Just as they were about to give up, Victoria noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible detail on the floor. A section of the wooden floorboards that was slightly raised, as if something was hidden beneath it. She had a strong feeling the desk may be hidden under the floorboards. Chapter 11. The Unspoken Truth. Victoria's heart pounded as she knelt down, examining the raised section of floorboards. The wood was old and weathered, but she could see a faint outline, a rectangular shape that suggested a hidden compartment beneath. "Eleanor, look!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. I think this is it." Eleanor hurried to her side, her eyes widening as she saw the outline on the floor. Together, they began to pry at the floorboards, using a piece of broken metal they had found nearby. The wood was stubborn, resisting their efforts, but they persevered, driven by a sense of urgency. Finally, with a loud crack, the floorboards gave way, revealing a hidden cavity beneath. It was a small, shallow space, just large enough to contain a writing desk. And there it was, covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, but otherwise intact, stood the writing desk from the photograph. The very desk with the nightingale lock. They carefully lifted the desk out of the cavity, their hands trembling with anticipation. It was heavier than they had expected, its mahogany frame solid and sturdy. They carried it out of the ruins and into the overgrown rose garden, where the last rays of the setting sun illuminated its intricate carvings and inlaid mother of pearl. They examined the desk carefully, searching for the nightingale lock. They found it on one of the smaller drawers, a tiny, almost imperceptible symbol of a nightingale engraved on its surface. Victoria took out the silver key, her hand shaking as she inserted it into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned the key, and with a soft click, the drawer sprung open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single document. It was a letter, written in a spidery, almost illegible script. Victoria recognized the handwriting as the same one they had seen on the Raven's messages. They unfolded the letter, their hearts pounding with anticipation. It was dated just a few days before Edward's disappearance, and it was addressed to Alistair Ashworth. The letter was a confession. The writer, who identified himself only as N, admitted to being the Nightingale, a high-ranking official who had been passing information to the enemy for years. He confessed to working with Alistair, the Raven, and to being responsible for the deaths of countless soldiers, including Edward Riley. He wrote that he was racked with guilt, that he could no longer live with the burden of his treachery. He had decided to expose Alistair and himself, to reveal the truth to the authorities. He had arranged a meeting with Edward, intending to give him the evidence he needed to bring them both to justice. But Alistair had found out about the meeting. He had intercepted Edward, and the letter ended abruptly, leaving the final act of betrayal to the imagination. Victoria and Eleanor stared at the letter, their eyes filled with a mixture of horror and relief. They had found the truth. They had uncovered the identity of the Nightingale, and they had confirmed Alistair's role in Edward's death. But who was N? Who was the Nightingale? As they reread the letter, Victoria noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible detail in the signature. A faint, almost invisible watermark, embedded in the paper. It was the crest of Sir Charles Barrington. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sir Charles, the kindly old gentleman who had helped them identify the key, the collector of antique locks and keys. He was the Nightingale. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man they had trusted, the man who had seemed so eager to help, had been their enemy all along. He had played them, manipulated them, leading them on a wild goose chase while concealing his own dark secret. No, Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. It can't be Sir Charles, he seemed so genuine. Victoria felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over her. She had been a fool. She had allowed herself to be deceived by a master manipulator, a man who had betrayed his country and caused the deaths of countless innocent people. He must be brought to justice. Chapter 12. Scars of the Soul. The revelation that Sir Charles Barrington was the Nightingale had shattered Victoria's world. The kindly, eccentric collector, the man who had seemed so eager to help, was a traitor, a spy responsible for the deaths of countless soldiers, including Edward. The betrayal cut deep, leaving a wound that felt raw and agonizing. He played us, Victoria said, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. He knew all along about the locket, about Edward, about the Raven. He manipulated us, led us on a wild goose chase while concealing his own guilt. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and confusion.
But why?
She whispered. Why would he help us if he was the Nightingale? Victoria paced the room, her mind racing, trying to make sense of Sir Charles's actions. I think he enjoyed the game, she said. He enjoyed the thrill of deception, of playing both sides. He probably thought he was untouchable, that he could get away with anything. She remembered Sir Charles's fascination with locks and keys, his gleeful excitement when he identified the Nightingale lock. It had all been an act, a performance designed to mislead them and protect his own secret.
But the letter, Eleanor said.
He confessed, he said, he wanted to expose Alistair. Victoria nodded. Yes, she said. But I think that was a lie, too. A way to throw us off his scent, to make us believe that he was on our side. He probably intended to destroy the letter, or use it against Alistair in some way. She felt a surge of determination. They couldn't let Sir Charles get away with it. They had to expose him, to bring him to justice.
But how?
He was a powerful man, with connections in high places. And the war was almost over. Would anyone even care about a spy who had operated years ago? We have the letter, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. That's evidence proof of his treachery.
Victoria nodded.
Yes, she said. But we need more. We need something that will definitively link him to the Nightingale, something that can't be explained away as a misunderstanding.
She remembered something.
The silver key, engraved with the Nightingale symbol. Sir Charles had identified it as belonging to a Nightingale lock, a very rare type of lock invented in the 18th century. He had claimed to be a collector of antique keys and locks. The key, Victoria said. We need to find out where he got the key. If we can trace it back to him, that would be irrefutable proof of his involvement. They decided to return to Sir Charles's estate, to confront him with their evidence and demand answers. But they knew it would be dangerous. Sir Charles was a desperate man, and he wouldn't hesitate to use violence to protect himself. They traveled back to the Cotswolds, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They arrived at Sir Charles's estate under the cover of darkness, sneaking through the gardens and approaching the house from the rear. They found a window that was slightly ajar, and Victoria, using her skills as a salvageur of artifacts, managed to open it without making a sound. They slipped inside the house, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. They made their way to Sir Charles's study, the room where he kept his collection of keys and locks. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Sir Charles was not there. They began to search the room, carefully examining the glass cases displaying his collection. They found several antique keys, but none of them matched the silver key with the Nightingale symbol. Just as they were about to give up, Victoria noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible detail on one of the display cases. A tiny scratch, as if something had been recently removed. She must have acted too quickly. Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom. The tiny scratch on the display case, where a key had presumably been, was a chilling confirmation of Victoria's suspicions. Sir Charles knew they were onto him. He had removed the matching key, the one that would irrefutably link him to the Nightingale. He's been here, Victoria whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and fear. He knows we're coming. He's probably getting rid of the evidence. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, her gaze settling on a fireplace, where a few embers still glowed.
Look,
she exclaimed, pointing to the hearth. Victoria hurried to the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest. There, amidst the ashes, lay the remnants of a fire, and sticking out from the charred remains was a small, silver object. It was the key, the matching key to the one they had found in the rose garden. Sir Charles had tried to destroy it, but he hadn't been entirely successful. The Nightingale symbol was still visible, albeit blackened and distorted by the heat. Victoria carefully retrieved the key, her fingers trembling as she held it in her hand. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable proof of Sir Charles's treachery. We have him, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. This is all we need. But just as she spoke, they heard a noise behind them. A footstep, a creak of the floorboards. They turned around, their hearts leaping into their throats. Sir Charles stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. He held a pistol in his hand, pointed directly at them. I see you've found my little secret, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. I was hoping to avoid this unpleasantness, but you've left me no choice. Victoria and Eleanor stood frozen, their eyes locked on the pistol. They were trapped. You're a traitor, Victoria said, her voice trembling but firm. You betrayed your country. You caused the deaths of countless soldiers, including Edward. Sir Charles smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. War is a messy business, my dear, he said. There are always casualties. And sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. The greater good? Victoria repeated, her voice filled with disgust. What greater good could possibly justify your treachery? Sir Charles shrugged. Let's just say I had my reasons, he said. Reasons that you wouldn't understand. You're too blinded by your sentimentality, your naive notions of patriotism and loyalty. He raised the pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. I'm afraid this is where our little game ends, he said. I can't allow you to leave this room alive. Eleanor stepped forward, shielding Victoria with her body.
No,
she cried. You won't hurt her. You've done enough damage already. Sir Charles hesitated, his eyes flickering with a flicker of something. Regret? Remorse? It was impossible to tell. Get out of the way, old woman, he said, his voice hardening. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me very much, Eleanor said, her voice firm. Edward was my husband. You killed him. You deserve to pay for your crimes. Sir Charles laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the room. You think you can stop me?
He said.
You're just a foolish old woman and a meddling girl. You're no match for me. He took a step forward, his pistol aimed directly at Eleanor. Victoria knew she had to do something, anything, to save her friend. She lunged forward, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table. With all her strength, she swung it at Sir Charles, striking him on the arm. The pistol went off, the bullet whizzing past Victoria's head, embedding itself in the wall. Sir Charles cried out in pain, dropping the pistol to the floor. Victoria didn't hesitate. She kicked the pistol away, then swung the candlestick again, striking Sir Charles on the head. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Victoria and Eleanor stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies trembling with shock and adrenaline. They had done it. They had stopped Sir Charles. They tied him up with a length of rope they found in a drawer, then went to call the authorities. As they waited for the police to arrive, Victoria looked at Eleanor, her heart filled with gratitude and admiration. You saved my life, she said, her voice choked with emotion. You were so brave, Eleanor smiled, a weak, tired smile. We did it together, she said. We brought him to justice. For Edward and for all the others. The arrival of authorities is imminent. Chapter 14. Beyond the barricades. The arrival of the authorities was swift and efficient. Sir Charles Barrington, the esteemed collector of antique keys and locks, was arrested and taken into custody, his carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered forever. The evidence, the letters, the journal, the 2 Nightingale keys was overwhelming. He was charged with espionage, treason, and multiple counts of murder. Victoria and Eleanor watched as he was led away, his head bowed, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. The man who had seemed so charming and helpful, the man who had manipulated them so skillfully, was finally exposed for what he was, a traitor, a murderer, a man who had betrayed his country for personal gain. The news of Sir Charles's arrest sent shockwaves through the small community of the Cotswolds and reverberated throughout the intelligence circles in London. The story was splashed across the newspapers, albeit with some details omitted for national security reasons. The public was outraged by his treachery, and many demanded the harshest possible punishment. For Victoria and Eleanor, the arrest brought a sense of closure, but it also left them with a profound sense of sadness and loss. They had uncovered the truth, they had brought a traitor to justice, but it couldn't bring back Edward, or any of the other countless victims of the war. They returned to London, exhausted but strangely relieved. The weight of the past, the burden of secrets and lies, had finally been lifted. They had faced danger and deception, and they had emerged stronger, their bond forged in the crucible of shared experience. Eleanor decided to stay in London, at least for a while. She had grown close to Victoria, and she found comfort in her companionship. They spent their days together, visiting museums, attending concerts, and exploring the city. They talked about Edward, about the war, about their hopes and dreams for the future. Victoria continued her work with the Historical Preservation Society, salvaging artifacts from war-damaged buildings. But her perspective had changed. She no longer saw herself as just a hunter of stories, a seeker of the whispers of the past. She was a guardian of memory, a protector of truth, a voice for those who had been silenced by war and betrayal. One day, as she was working in the ruins of a bombed-out church, she found something. A small, wooden cross carved from a piece of shrapnel. It was a simple, crude object, but it held a powerful resonance. She imagined a soldier, carving it in the trenches, perhaps as a talisman, a symbol of hope amidst the horrors of war. She held the cross in her hand, feeling a connection to the unknown soldier, a sense of shared humanity that transcended time and space. She realized that the war had not only destroyed lives and buildings, it had also created a legacy of resilience, courage, and compassion. She decided to keep the cross as a reminder of the human cost of war and as a symbol of hope for a better future. A future where such tragedies would never happen again. A future where love and truth would triumph over hatred and deception. She felt Edward wouldn't be forgotten. Chapter 15. A glimmer of hope. The war was finally over. Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, brought a wave of jubilation and relief that swept across London and the entire nation. People poured into the streets, cheering, singing, and dancing, celebrating the end of the long, bloody conflict. Victoria and Eleanor joined the crowds, their hearts filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. They were grateful that the fighting had stopped, that the killing was over. But they also mourned the millions of lives lost, the countless dreams shattered, the futures that would never be. They stood in Trafalgar Square, surrounded by a sea of jubilant faces, listening to the bells ringing out from St. Paul's Cathedral. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of joy and relief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. "It's over," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's finally over." Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. She thought of Edward, of her brother Thomas, of all the young men who had perished in the mud and blood of the trenches. She thought of the shattered lives, the broken hearts, the families torn apart by war. "They won't be forgotten," she said, her voice firm. "We'll make sure of it." As the celebrations continued, Victoria and Eleanor found themselves drawn to a quieter corner of the square, near a makeshift memorial that had been erected to honor the fallen. People had placed flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes at the base of the memorial, creating a poignant tribute to the lost generation. Victoria and Eleanor added their own tributes, a single red rose for Edward and a small, wooden cross for Thomas. They stood there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a shared sense of grief and remembrance. As they were about to leave, Victoria noticed a familiar figure standing near the memorial. It was a young man, dressed in a worn military uniform, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a haunted look. He was staring at a photograph of a young woman, a woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of auburn curls. It was Arthur, Victoria's fiancé. He was alive. Victoria gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She had given up hope of ever seeing him again. His last letter, received months ago, had been filled with such despair, such a sense of foreboding, that she had convinced herself he was dead. "Arthur!" she cried, rushing towards him. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Victoria?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. They embraced, clinging to each other as if they would never let go. Tears streamed down their faces, a mixture of joy, relief, and the lingering pain of separation and loss. I thought you were dead," Victoria sobbed. "I received no letters. I didn't know what to think." Arthur held her tight, stroking her hair, his voice choked with emotion. I was wounded," he said. Captured, I spent months in a German hospital. I couldn't write. I couldn't let you know. He explained that he had been released after the armistice, and he had returned to London just a few days earlier. He had been searching for her, desperately hoping that she was still alive. Victoria introduced Arthur to Eleanor, and the three of them stood there, talking for hours, sharing their stories, their experiences, their losses, and their hopes. Arthur listened intently as Victoria and Eleanor recounted their adventure, their discovery of the locket, their pursuit of the raven and the nightingale. "You are so brave," he said, his eyes filled with admiration. "You uncovered a conspiracy. You brought a traitor to justice. You did what I couldn't do." Victoria shook her head. "We did it together," she said. "Eleanor and I and Edward. His spirit guided us, I believe." Arthur looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said. "Edward, he was a good man. A hero." Eleanor nodded, tears welling up in her eyes.
"He was," she said.
"And now he can finally rest in peace." As the day drew to a close and the crowds began to disperse, Victoria, Arthur, and Eleanor walked away from Trafalgar Square, their arms linked together. They had all been touched by the war, scarred by its horrors, but they had also found strength, resilience, and a renewed sense of hope. They must try to forge ahead. Chapter 16. The Raven's Omen. The reunion with Arthur had been a miracle, a beacon of hope in the lingering shadows of war. But the scars of the past ran deep, and the joy of his return was tempered by the knowledge of all that had been lost, all that could never be recovered. Arthur was a changed man. The youthful optimism, the carefree spirit that Victoria had loved so dearly, had been replaced by a haunted look, a weariness that seemed to weigh him down. He spoke little of his experiences as a prisoner of war, but Victoria could see the pain in his eyes, the unspoken horrors that lingered in his memory. They spent their days together, rediscovering each other, trying to rebuild their shattered lives. They walked in the parks, visited museums, and attended concerts, seeking solace in the beauty and tranquility of the city that was slowly healing from the wounds of war. But the past continued to intrude, casting a long shadow over their present. The case of Sir Charles Barrington, the Nightingale, was still ongoing. He had pleaded not guilty, and his lawyers were mounting a vigorous defense, claiming that the evidence against him was circumstantial and unreliable. Victoria and Eleanor were called to testify at the trial, recounting their discovery of the locket, the letters, and the key, and their confrontation with Sir Charles at his estate. They faced intense cross-examination from the defense lawyers, who tried to discredit their testimony, portraying them as naive and impressionable women who had been misled by their own imaginations. But Victoria and Eleanor stood firm, their voices clear and unwavering, their testimony unshakable. They had faced danger and deception, and they had emerged stronger, their resolve hardened by the crucible of their experience. The trial dragged on for weeks, attracting intense media attention. The public was fascinated by the story of the aristocratic spy, the betrayal of trust, and the courageous women who had brought him to justice. One day, as Victoria and Arthur were walking in Hyde Park, they encountered a group of people gathered around a newspaper stand. The headline screamed, "Barrington acquitted." Victoria's heart sank. She couldn't believe it. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Sir Charles had been found not guilty. The jury had been swayed by his lawyers' arguments, by the doubts they had sown about the reliability of the evidence and the credibility of the witnesses. "It's not fair," Victoria said, her voice filled with anger and frustration. "He's guilty. He deserves to be punished." Arthur put his arm around her, trying to comfort her. "I know," he said, "but sometimes justice doesn't prevail. The system is flawed. There are loopholes. Powerful people can manipulate the truth." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "We did what we could," he said. "We exposed him. We brought his treachery to light. That's all we can do." But Victoria couldn't accept it. She couldn't let Sir Charles get away with it. She felt a burning sense of injustice, a deep-seated need for retribution. As they walked away from the newspaper stand, Victoria noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible detail on the ground. A single black feather. A raven's feather. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she held it in her hand. It was an omen, a sign, a reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. She knew that Sir Charles, despite his acquittal, would never be truly free. He would always be haunted by his past, by the ghosts of his victims, by the knowledge of his own treachery. And she, Victoria, would always be there, a silent witness, a guardian of memory, a reminder of the price of betrayal. She resolved to leave the city. Chapter 17. Shattered Reflections. The acquittal of Sir Charles Barrington had left a bitter taste in Victoria's mouth. The justice system, the very foundation of their society, had failed. The weight of this injustice, coupled with the lingering trauma of the war and the constant reminders of loss in London, became too much to bear. "I need to get away," she told Arthur one evening, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "I can't stay here in this city surrounded by these memories." Arthur, his own spirit scarred by the war, understood. He had seen the toll that the past few months had taken on her, the way she flinched at loud noises, the nightmares that plagued her sleep, the constant tension that held her body captive. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Victoria had been thinking about it for days, ever since she had found the raven's feather, that ominous symbol of betrayal and deceit. She needed a place of peace, a place of healing, a place where she could escape the shadows of the past. "Cornwall," she said, her voice firm. "I've always loved the sea, the wildness, the freedom. I think it might help me heal." Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He knew that he couldn't go with her. He had his own demons to battle, his own wounds to heal. He needed to stay in London, to rebuild his life, to find a new purpose in the aftermath of the war. "I'll come and visit you," he promised. "Whenever I can. Will Wright will stay in touch." They embraced, clinging to each other as if they were afraid of letting go. They knew that this separation would be difficult, but they also knew that it was necessary. They both needed time to heal, to find their own paths forward. Victoria packed her bags, taking only the essentials, her clothes, her books, her drawing supplies, and the locket, that constant reminder of Edward and Eleanor, of love and loss, of courage and betrayal. She said goodbye to Eleanor, who was heartbroken to see her go, but who understood the need for a fresh start. They promised to stay in touch, to visit each other whenever possible. Victoria took the train to Cornwall, leaving behind the smoky skies and crowded streets of London for the wild, windswept coast and the vast expanse of the sea. She found a small cottage to rent, overlooking a secluded cove, where the waves crashed against the rocks and the seagulls cried overhead. She spent her days walking along the cliffs, breathing in the fresh sea air, feeling the wind in her hair, listening to the rhythm of the waves. She drew and painted, capturing the beauty of the landscape, the ever-changing moods of the sea, the vibrant colors of the wildflowers that bloomed along the coast. She slowly began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the tension in her body began to ease, the shadows of the past began to fade. She found solace in the solitude, in the beauty of nature, in the simple rhythm of life by the sea. But the memories were still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. One day, as she was walking along the beach, she saw a reflection in a tide pool. It was her own face, but it looked different, older, wearier, haunted by the ghosts of the past. She realized that she could never truly escape the past. It was a part of her, woven into the fabric of her being. But she could learn to live with it, to accept it, to find a way to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with her. She has to heal, and the sea might be the best cure. Chapter 18. The Weight of Silence. The Cornish coast, with its rugged cliffs, wild seas, and windswept moors, offer Victoria a sanctuary, a place to breathe and begin the slow, arduous process of healing. The solitude was both a balm and a burden. It allowed her to confront her inner turmoil without the distractions of city life, but it also amplified the echoes of the past. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Victoria settled into a quiet routine. She walked, she sketched, she read, She wrote long letters to Arthur and Eleanor, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, sharing her struggles and her small victories. Arthur visited whenever he could, stealing away from London for a few precious days. Their reunions were bittersweet, filled with a mixture of joy and longing. They talked for hours, sharing their experiences, their hopes, and their fears. They walked along the beach, hand in hand, watching the sunsets, finding solace in each other's company. But the distance between them remained, a physical and emotional gap that was difficult to bridge. Arthur was rebuilding his life in London, finding work as an architect, trying to find a new purpose in the aftermath of the war. Victoria was slowly piecing herself back together in Cornwall, seeking solace in the solitude and the beauty of nature. One day, as Victoria was exploring a hidden cove, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned fisherman's cottage. It was a small, stone building, nestled against the cliffs, its windows boarded up, its roof partially collapsed. It looked as if it had been empty for years. She felt drawn to it, intrigued by its history, by the stories it might hold. She managed to pry open one of the boarded-up windows and climbed inside. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with the remnants of a life lived long ago. A rusty stove stood in one corner, a broken table and chairs in another. A faded photograph on the mantelpiece showed a young couple, their faces blurred with age, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Victoria felt a familiar pang of sadness, a sense of connection to the unknown couple, to the lives that had been touched by this place. She spent hours exploring the cottage, examining the objects, imagining the stories they could tell. She found a small, wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of letters. They were old, yellowed with age, the ink faded almost to the point of illegibility. Victoria carefully unfolded one of the letters, her heart pounding with anticipation. The handwriting was familiar, a spidery, almost illegible script. It was the same handwriting she had seen on the Raven's messages, on the letter found in the Nightingale lock. It was another confession. This time, the writer identified himself as a fisherman, a man who had lived in this very cottage. He confessed to being a part of Alastair Ashworth's spy network, a courier, responsible for carrying messages between the Raven and his German contacts. He wrote that he had been forced into it, threatened by Alastair, who had known about his past, his debts, his vulnerabilities. He had been a reluctant participant, a pawn in a dangerous game. He wrote about his guilt, his shame, his fear. He had witnessed the consequences of his actions, the devastation caused by the information he had helped to transmit. He had seen the ships sinking, the soldiers dying, the families torn apart. He had decided to confess, to reveal the truth, to try to atone for his sins. He had written this letter, intending to send it to the authorities. But he had never had the courage. He had hidden it away, hoping that one day, someone would find it, someone who would bring the truth to light. Victoria read the letter with a mixture of horror and compassion. She understood the fisherman's fear, his reluctance, his shame. He had been a victim, too, caught in a web of deceit and betrayal. This changes the perspective. She must find a way to use the letter. Chapter 19. In the ruins of yesterday. The fisherman's confession, discovered in the abandoned cottage, added another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of wartime secrets. It confirmed Alastair Ashworth's guilt, but it also revealed the extent of his network, the reach of his treachery, and the human cost of his actions. Victoria felt a renewed sense of purpose, a burning desire to bring the full truth to light. She knew that Sir Charles Barrington had been acquitted, that the legal system had failed. But she couldn't let it end there. She couldn't allow Alastair to escape justice, to live a life of privilege and impunity while his victims suffered in silence. She decided to return to London, to share the fisherman's letter with Eleanor and Arthur, and to devise a plan to expose Alastair's crimes to the public. The journey back to London was filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She was eager to see her friends, to share her discovery, but she also dreaded returning to the city, to the place where so much pain and loss had occurred. She arrived in London to find the city in a state of flux. The war was over, but the scars were still visible, the wounds still raw. The economy was struggling, unemployment was high, and there was a sense of unease and uncertainty about the future. She met with Eleanor and Arthur, sharing the fisherman's letter and her plan to expose Alistair. They were both shocked by the contents of the letter, but they also agreed that something had to be done. "We can't let him get away with it," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "He destroyed so many lives, he deserves to be punished." Arthur, his own experiences in the war fueling his sense of justice, nodded in agreement. "But how?" he asked. "The courts have failed, we need to find another way." They brainstormed ideas, considering various options. They could go to the press, but they knew that the newspapers were often more interested in sensationalism than in truth. They could try to pressure the government to reopen the investigation, but they knew that would be a long and difficult process, with no guarantee of success. Finally, Victoria had an idea. She remembered a journalist, a woman named Beatrice Hastings, who had covered the Sir Charles Barrington trial. Beatrice was known for her investigative skills, her integrity, and her commitment to uncovering the truth. Perhaps Beatrice Hastings could help us," Victoria suggested. "She might be willing to publish the fisherman's letter, to expose Alistair's crimes to the public." They decided to contact Beatrice, to share their story and seek her assistance. They met with her in a small cafe, a discreet location where they could speak freely. Beatrice listened intently as they recounted their experiences, their discoveries, and their frustrations with the legal system. She examined the fisherman's letter, her eyes widening as she read the confession. This is explosive," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "This could change everything, but it's also dangerous. Alistair Ashworth is a powerful man. He won't hesitate to retaliate." They knew the risks, but they were determined to proceed. They had come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. Beatrice agreed to help them. She promised to investigate Alistair's past, to gather more evidence, and to publish the fisherman's letter in her newspaper, exposing his treachery to the world. They left the cafe feeling a renewed sense of hope, a sense of purpose. They had taken a significant step towards achieving justice, towards bringing Alistair Ashworth to account for his crimes. The next step will require courage. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Beatrice Hastings, true to her word, launched a full-scale investigation into Alistair Ashworth's past. She delved into his family history, his financial dealings, his social connections, and his wartime activities. She uncovered a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal that stretched back years. She discovered that Alistair had been involved in numerous shady business deals, that he had amassed a considerable fortune through illegal means, and that he had used his wealth and influence to silence his critics and cover up his crimes. She also found evidence that Alistair had continued his espionage activities even after the war, passing information to foreign powers, undermining British interests, and endangering national security. Beatrice published her findings in a series of explosive articles, exposing Alistair's treachery to the world. The public was outraged, demanding justice, calling for his arrest and prosecution. The government, pressured by public opinion and the weight of the evidence, was forced to reopen the investigation into Alistair's wartime activities. He was arrested, charged with treason, espionage, and multiple counts of murder. This time, there would be no escape. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the public mood was unforgiving. Alistair Ashworth was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. Victoria, Eleanor, and Arthur attended the trial, witnessing the final downfall of the man who had caused them so much pain and suffering. They felt a sense of closure, a sense of justice served, but it was a bittersweet victory. The scars of the past would never fully heal. The memories of loss would never fade. After the trial, Victoria and Arthur returned to Cornwall, to the small cottage overlooking the sea. They had both been changed by their experiences, scarred by the war and its aftermath, but they had also found strength, resilience, and a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. They decided to get married, to build a new life together, to create a future filled with love, hope, and healing. They held a small, intimate ceremony on the beach, with Eleanor as their witness. As they exchanged their vows, the sun set over the ocean, casting a golden glow on the waves. Victoria looked at Arthur, her heart filled with love and gratitude. They had survived the war, they had overcome betrayal and loss, and they had found their way back to each other. They knew that the future would not be easy, that there would be challenges and setbacks, but they were ready to face them together, their love a beacon of hope in a world still struggling to heal from the wounds of the past. The final chapter of their wartime romance had been written, a chapter filled with courage, resilience, and the enduring power of love. They stood together, ready to face the future. Epilogue. Years passed, and the scars of the Great War slowly began to fade, replaced by the gentle patina of time. Victoria and Arthur settled into a peaceful life in Cornwall, raising a family, building a home, and finding solace in the beauty of the sea and the rugged landscape. Arthur returned to his architecture, designing homes and buildings that reflected a new era, a sense of optimism and renewal. Victoria continued her art, capturing the ever-changing moods of the sea, the vibrant colors of the wildflowers, and the quiet strength of the Cornish coast. Eleanor became a frequent visitor, a beloved aunt to their children, a cherished friend and confidant. She never remarried, but she found a new sense of purpose in her connection to Victoria and Arthur's family, sharing her memories of Edward, keeping his spirit alive in their hearts. The locket, once a symbol of loss and betrayal, became a treasured heirloom, a reminder of the courage and resilience that had brought them through the darkness and into the light. It was passed down through the generations, a tangible link to the past, a testament to the enduring power of love and the importance of remembering. The story of Captain Edward Riley, the Raven, and the Nightingale became a part of family lore, a whispered tale told on stormy nights, a reminder of the sacrifices made, the battles fought, and the secrets uncovered. Victoria often walked along the cliffs, gazing out at the vast expanse of the sea, feeling the wind in her hair, listening to the cries of the seagulls. She remembered the fisherman's cottage, the hidden letters, the weight of silence that had finally been lifted. She thought of Alastair Ashworth, spending his final years in prison, his life a testament to the destructive power of greed and betrayal. She thought of Sir Charles Barrington, his reputation ruined, his legacy forever tainted by his treachery. She thought of Edward, of Thomas, of all the young men and women who had perished in the war, their lives cut short, their dreams unfulfilled. She vowed to never forget them, to honor their memory, to work for a future where such tragedies would never happen again. And as the sun set over the ocean, casting a golden glow on the waves, Victoria felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude, a sense of hope. The war had taken much, but it had also given her strength, resilience, and a profound appreciation for the preciousness of life, the enduring power of love, and the importance of remembering. The circle was complete. The end.